After my death, I watched as my family continued with their lives, unaware that the girl they dismissed so easily was no longer just missing but gone entirely. It had been a sweltering day when they found my body, distorted and bloated in the heat, abandoned in a decaying warehouse on the edge of town. Construction workers stumbled upon me by chance, and the horrified expressions they wore as they gagged and phoned the authorities said it all. My father, David Lambert, a celebrated detective known for his sharp instincts, rushed to the scene from my sister Lily's match banquet, with my mother, Dr. Stella Zimmer, the city's top forensic pathologist, by his side. They were seasoned in handling the macabre and unsettling, but seeing the body, even they flinched. Stella's mouth tightened as she approached the scene. She muttered to herself, "Somebody's daughter." Such a cruel end, with a faint trace of compassion in her tone. They didn't know it was me. They couldn't. My face had been beaten beyond recognition, my throat slashed nearly to the bone. The injuries were brutal, and every feature that might have given me away was either marred or missing. But as Stella began her initial examination, she noticed a ring on my finger, a ring I'd made for each member of the family. They had scoffed at it when I gave it to them, and Lily even said it looked tacky. Stella handed it to her assistant, Ruby, with hardly a second glance. She didn't notice it was the same ring she'd thrown in a drawer at home, dismissing the gift as though it were nothing. As Ruby bagged the ring, I realized how little my existence had ever mattered to them. My mind wandered back to the last time I'd seen my family. Lily had a tennis match that day, and all they cared about was making it on time to cheer her on. When my killer took my phone and called my dad, his only words had been, "We'll handle this tomorrow. Today is Lily's day." He hadn't even noticed my desperate silence. And in that moment, the realization that Lily was their only priority hit me harder than the fists of my killer. As Stella examined my body with her usual clinical detachment, she turned to Ruby, saying, "A young woman, probably early 20s. Cause of death looks like blunt force trauma and a slashed throat. We need to fast-track this case. The media will be all over it once word gets out." Ruby nodded, but there was an unease in her eyes. She respected Stella as a brilliant professional but knew her colleague had a blind spot for her family, particularly when it came to me. Even now, I could see the way Ruby hesitated, sensing the unspoken disconnect between Stella's compassion for a stranger and the coldness she showed her own daughter. Back at the station, Dad took command of the investigation, issuing instructions with a calm but severe tone. "Search for anything unusual within a 10-mile radius of the crime scene. This isn't the first body dumped there. We may be dealing with a repeat offender," he stated, his voice impassive. They were analyzing my death as just another case, another puzzle to solve, never suspecting it was their own daughter. Meanwhile, Eddie, my older brother and the only family member who ever looked out for me, was frantically trying to reach me. He'd called me countless times since the match but only got voicemail. Eddie had always sensed my isolation. He knew how Lily thrived on our parents' attention and twisted them around her finger, making sure I was cast aside at every turn. He'd confronted my parents about it, but they brushed him off, telling him to stop creating needless drama. Eddie called again, his worry growing, but this time Stella answered, clearly irritated. "Eddie, this better not be about Emily again. She's probably just throwing one of her usual tantrums. Lily's match is tomorrow, and we need to be there for her. If Emily wants to disappear, that's her choice." "But Mom," Eddie's voice cracked. "You don't know Emily like I do. She wouldn't just vanish like this. She was always there doing little things. Like those pain patches for Dad's shoulder." "Enough, Eddie." Stella snapped, a cold edge to her voice. "Lily's the one we need to focus on. She's our daughter just as much as Emily ever was. I don't have time for these antics." As I stood beside her, invisible and silent, I wanted to scream to tell her how wrong she was. I'd been there for them, in small ways they never noticed. Every minor gesture, every attempt to be seen, none of it had ever been enough. They'd lost sight of me, and now, even as my body lay right before them, they couldn't see who I was. Days passed, and as the investigation went on, The team managed to retrieve a note that had been left inside my stomach. It was almost entirely corroded by stomach acid, but one word was still visible. Family. Chester, a friend of my parents and a fellow investigator, approached them with a grim look. He told them about the note, suggesting that maybe the victim had been someone's daughter, someone whose family had overlooked her suffering. David nodded solemnly but then brushed it off, saying, "That's the cruelty of this world. Children get lost, and some never come home." He said it as if he weren't describing his own daughter, as if I hadn't been the one he'd lost years ago. Then the DNA results came back, and the truth could no longer be ignored. Ruby pulled Stella aside, her voice barely above a whisper. "Dr. Zimmer, the DNA matches. It's Emily." The color drained from Stella's face as the reality hit her. She stood frozen, unable to process that the disfigured body she'd examined, the girl she'd barely spared a thought for, was her own daughter. Suddenly, all those moments she dismissed as antics flashed before her. The phone calls she ignored, the small acts of kindness she dismissed as inconsequential, the time Eddie begged her to pay more attention to me. Each memory was now stained with the guilt of a mother who had failed to see her child. David, hearing the news, went still, his cigarette dropping to the ground. He couldn't look at anyone, the weight of his own neglect suffocating him. The truth tore through them, but it was too late. I was gone, the unappreciated daughter who had tried for years to be a part of their world, only to be cast aside again and again. Eddie, when he heard, broke down in tears, realizing that his worries had been valid all along. He had lost the only person who understood his loneliness in that house. In the end, my parents became haunted by what they'd overlooked. In their minds, Lily's matches, her accolades, and her laughter echoed through the house, a painful reminder of all the things they prioritized over their own blood. My face, unseen and marred by death, became a ghostly presence they could never shake, a silent accusation hanging in the air, a reminder that sometimes, even family can be the most tragic of strangers.